Hi everybody, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Thursday, the 21st, where we are talking about poetry. I wanted to remind you that our second journal is due today. If you're watching this video on the 21st, that will be on drama, and I'm just asking that you briefly respond in about a page or so to each of the three major dramas that we've read this semester: Oedipus the King, Midsummer Night's Dream, and finally A Raisin in the Sun, and send that to me via PDF to my email by 11:59 p.m. And my email is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And I will evaluate that for content, not for grammar or mechanics, and put a checkmark grade on that and then return that to you. Hopefully that will help you with your second paper. And what I wanted to do was to set aside some class time when we're getting a little bit closer to the due date for the second paper. So I thought we could set aside some class time on the 28th, which is Thursday, for you to work on that paper. So I'm going to be changing around a few of the due dates in our course outline. Rather than do a catch-up today, I thought that I would continue to discuss poetry. And if you'll remember, last class we ended up by talking about the fact that poetry has no real clear definition. It oftentimes is identified through its structure because it utilizes things like rhyme or meter or alliteration, but it doesn't necessarily have to. It is very dense and compact, so it is going to require multiple rereadings, and it oftentimes examines emotional states, and emotional states oftentimes are not logical, which means that ultimately poetry might not always be logical. And our textbook gives some suggestions on how to read responsively. This is on page 589. You can also see this in the notes below. To read poetry out loud, you really want to listen to the musicality of the poem. And if you've ever gone to a poetry reading, you know how important it is to be able to listen to the poet actually read their works. The Pleasure of Words on page 593 to 596 talks about the importance of reading poetry critically, the way that we have been reading short story and the way that we have been reading drama critically. So what you want to do is to take notes. In other words, you want to be able to annotate. And ultimately, you will be writing a journal at the ending of the poetry unit where I'm going to ask you to select 3 poems and to respond briefly to each of the 3. You won't have a paper about poetry, but your final exam, the bulk of it, 80%, will be devoted to poetry, with another 10 points devoted to short story, and then finally 10 points devoted to drama. And there'll be choice within those 2 sections as well. And one of the things that they did on page 594 is that they give you a poem. This one is entitled Uh-Oh. And then on the page next to it, page 595, we see an example of somebody annotating. And this is something that we've seen with drama and with short story as well, where you could see that an individual has gone through and taken notes about things that seem to be relevant, whether it be the title of the poem or some of the language that's used or some of the sounds within that particular poem. So one of the poems that I did want to spend a little bit of time on is on page 596. And the poem is called Catch. And the suggestions from the textbook, and I have similar suggestions, is that after you read a poem, and I suggested minimum 3 readings, the first being just for understanding the content. And then what I would do is to paraphrase it, to try to summarize in your own language what's happening in that poem. Then to go back to the poem and to analyze that poem. And then finally to reread that poem at a later time to refresh your memory. So this poem is also found online, so that if it turns out that you don't have access to the textbook, you can read this poem online. And you'll see that I will be including, and I already have included, links for the poetry. In our course outline, some of the poems are listed as on handouts. Obviously, we aren't meeting in person, so they wouldn't be on a handout. I would be providing the links for those. And in fact, you can see that I've provided some of those links already for you to prepare for the future poetry. But basically, this poem, and it was written by Robert Francis in 1950, entitled Catch, again on page 596 of our textbook. Two boys uncoached are tossing a poem together. Overhand, underhand, backhand, sleight of hand, every hand. Teasing with attitudes, latitudes, interludes, altitudes. High, make him fly off the ground for it. Low, make him stoop. Make him scoop it up. Make him as almost as possible miss it. Fast, let him sting from it. Now, fool him slowly. Anything, everything, tricky, risky, nonchalant. Anything under the sun to outwit the prosy. Over the tree and the long sweet cadence down, over his head, make him scramble to pick up the meaning. And now, like a posy, a pretty one plump in his hands. And probably you didn't get a lot out of that if that was your first reading, which is why I suggest multiple readings. Notice that we're given a paraphrase here where somebody tried to express in complete sentences what the content of this poem is. A poet's relationship to a reader is similar to a game of catch. The poem, like a ball, should be pitched in a variety of ways to challenge and create interest. Boredom and predictability must be avoided if the game is to be engaging and satisfying. And certainly while the paraphrase captures the summary of the poem, it doesn't have the beauty or the creativity or the originality of the actual poem itself. And some of the points that I wanted to make about the poem, the first line, where it says that two boys are uncoached, and I think that's so important, the emphasis on the idea of a pair, because when we're talking about poetry, there's the writer and there's also the reader. That they're boys, they're children, the idea that they don't need to be coached, they don't need to be schooled. Anybody can write and read poetry. Though, of course, if somebody has been coached, they're more likely to have a greater facility for being able to read and write poetry. And also the fact that boys rather than girls or children is expressed in that first line, I think is very indicative of the 1950s, where literature was oftentimes a male-dominated profession. And they're tossing the poem together the way one would toss a ball. In other words, this is a game. Writing and reading poetry is like a game. It's a physical workout, but it also can bring a good amount of pleasure. And notice the repetition in the second line of the word hand. Overhand, underhand, backhand, sleight of hand, every hand. And of course, hands are necessary for playing catch. Hands are also necessary for writing poetry, even for reading, the idea that you're taking notes or annotating. Teasing, and I would say that's what poetry does, is it tease. You're trying to decipher the meaning. With attitudes, latitudes, interludes, altitudes. Notice how the endings of those words all have similar sounds, so that rhyme that's there. High, make him fly off the ground for it. Low, make him stoop. In other words, this is going to be a workout. Make him scoop it up. Make him, as almost as possible, miss it. The poet's job is much like the pitcher's job, to make the recipient have to work towards being able to accomplish the task. Fast, let him sting from it. Now, fool him slowly. And perhaps that's a definition of poetry, is that it attempts to fool. Anything, everything tricky, risky, and nonchalant. We'll see lots of tricky and risky things within the poetry unit. Anything under the sun to outwit the prosy. So there is this sense of trying to outwit. Over the tree and the long sweet cadence down. And think about the word cadence, which is about sound, and how ultimately a ball flying through the air could make a sound, a whistle. And it's also an element of poetry, the musicality of it. Over his head, make him scramble to pick up the meaning. So expect that you're going to have to do a little bit of scrambling. And now, like a posy, a pretty one plump in his hands. Notice all of the repetition of the P sounds. So the initial consonant is repeated, and that's alliteration. And notice P is also the sound for poetry, which is what we were talking about here. So in terms of thinking about how to approach poetry, on page 606 through 607, we're given some suggestions. Luckily, many of these suggestions are very similar to suggestions we've already been given for short story and drama. Assume it's necessary to read more than once. Pay attention to the title. It usually has significance. As you read for the first time, avoid becoming entangled in words or in lines that you don't understand. Instead, give yourself a chance to take in the entire poem before attempting to resolve problems within it. Look up words and passages you don't understand. And while this is something that should be done with short story and drama as well, it'll be particularly important for poetry, which is oftentimes so short and so dense and so compact. Read the poem out loud, as I had suggested. Read the punctuation and understand that poets will oftentimes break rules of punctuation and grammar and mechanics for particular purposes, much like we saw with the short story Girl that almost read like a poem. Paraphrase the poem. Try to put it into your own language. Try to get a sense of who's speaking. Don't assume that the speaker is the author. Assume every element in the poem has a purpose. Be generous. Be willing to entertain different perspectives, values, experiences, and subjects. And keep in mind that we've talked about literary analysis and that it's quite possible to have two literary interpretations that are in complete contrast to one another and both be valid if there's evidence to support that particular position. This is especially true in poetry, which is oftentimes ambiguous and subjective. But that said, you still are required to have analysis from the text to support a possible interpretation. Develop a coherent approach to the poem. So this gets back to critical strategies for reading that we were discussing at the beginning of the semester, thinking about things like author biography or thinking about the history of the time period and how that might help inform your reading. And don't expect to produce a definitive reading. I think that's true for all literature, but particularly, again, for poetry. So, one of the things that the textbook talks about is the distinction between formulaic poetry and that which is more literary. And we've been talking about that all semester long as well. Popular formulaic writing. We began short story by talking about a Harlequin romance. We moved into drama by talking about television. And now we have an example of a greeting card, which is a place where you will oftentimes find formulaic and popular poetry writing. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it certainly is probably not the kind of poetry that we would devote our time and attention to. And I wanted to illustrate that by reading you both poems. And the first is the formulaic poem that you would find on a greeting card. This is on page 609, and it's entitled The Magic of Love. There's a wonderful gift that can give you a gift. It's a blessing from heaven above. It can comfort and bless. It can bring happiness. It's the wonderful magic of love. Like a star in the night, it can keep your faith bright. Like the sun, it can warm your hearts too. It's a gift you can give every day that you live, and when given, it comes back to you. When love lights the way, there is joy in the day, and all troubles are lighter to bear. Love is gentle and kind, and through love you will find there's an answer to your every prayer. May you never depart from your two loving hearts. May you treasure this gift from above. You will find if you do, all your dreams will come true in the wonderful magic of love. And you probably don't need to reread this poem because it's fairly clear and simplistic. Again, that's not necessarily a bad thing because that's what you would expect in a greeting card. And it has rhyme, and you notice it has a very sing-song kind of rhythm, but it doesn't really say anything unique or interesting about love. It's very cliche, so it can apply to a very wide audience and a wide number of situations. Again, exactly what you would want to do with the greeting card. So take another poem. This one was written by John Frederick Nims in 1947. That's also about love, but notice how different it is. Love poem. My clumsiest dear, whose hands shipwreck vases, at whose quick touch all glasses chip and ring, whose palms are bowls in china, burrs in linen, and have no cunning with any soft thing, except all ill at ease fidgeting people, the refugee uncertain at the door, you make it home. Deftly you steady the drunk, clamoring on his undulate floor. Unpredictable deer, the taxi driver's terror, shrinking from far headlights pale as a dime, yet leaping before red apoplectic streetcars, misfit in any space and never on time. A wrench in clocks and the solar system. Only with words and people in love you move at ease. In traffic of wit expertly maneuver and keep us, all devotion, at your knees. Forgetting your coffee spreading on our flannel, your lipstick grinning on our coat. So gaily in love's unbreakable heaven, our souls on glory of spilt bourbon float. Be with me, darling, early and late. Smash glasses. I will study rye music for your sake. For should your hands drop white and empty, all the toys of the world would break. And my suspicion is that you would need to read this poem multiple times in order to be able to begin to decipher the meaning. Notice that many of these poems in our textbook have questions at the ending of the poems that can help direct your reading, much like we saw with short story and drama. For instance, to compare the two speakers, which do you find more appealing and why? Or how does Nim's description of love differ from Fairies? Fairies being the first poem where love was rather simplistic and cliche. It's much more much more creative and unusual and unpredictable in love poem. If you're looking at love poem, you'll notice that it's divided up into sections, almost like paragraphs. There's a term for this in poetry. It's called stanzas. And those stanzas are basically functioning much like a paragraph, that these stanzas deal with one particular topic or idea. A poem need not be divided into stanzas, but this one does happen to be divided into stanzas. And note that the line of a poem need not end towards the ending punctuation. It can end at any point, in the midpoint of a sentence, for instance. So you want to keep that in mind as well. Why would the author have made particular decisions about where to end the line? Of course, when we write in sentences or prose, as opposed to verse or poetry, we use the ending punctuation to end that particular thought or sentence. And we basically move on to the next line when we've run out of space. That isn't necessarily the case with poetry. So don't assume that the ending of the line is necessarily the ending of that particular thought. And also make decisions about why it is, or at least make some evaluations about why it is that an author might have made the choices the author made about where to end lines and where to put ending punctuation, if there even is punctuation in the poem. So the first stanza reads, "My clumsiest dear," which is not what you would expect in a love poem. Dear is a phrase of affection, but clumsy usually is not seen as something that's positive. So already it upsets our expectations. If this is supposed to be a love poem, we expect compliments. My clumsiest dear, whose hands shipwreck vases. In other words, this person is so clumsy, they don't break vases, they shipwreck them. And think about the distinction between breaking and shipwrecking. A huge disaster. Think about the Titanic. At whose quick touch all glasses chip and ring. Or in other words, that basically whenever they're around glass, they're likely to hurt or break that glass. Whose palms are bulls in china. If you've ever heard the expression a bull in a china shop, china is supposed to be delicate and a bull is supposed to be the exact opposite. That's how this person is. Burrs in linen. Again, linen is supposed to be very soft, and burrs, they happen to be these sticky plants that will stick onto something like linen. Again, the contrast between rough and smooth, that this person is rough with smooth objects. And have no cunning with any soft thing. So basically we have an entire stanza that's talking about the negative qualities of this person. Again, upsetting expectations. But as we move forward, the second stanza indicates a shift, beginning with the word accept. Accept all ill at ease fidgeting people. That this person has grace with people who are ill at ease and fidgeting because they're ill at ease. In other words, this person has social graces, not necessarily physical graces. The refugee uncertain at the door, you make it home. And think about this idea that somebody is at your door and is so ill at ease that they are a refugee. Think about the definition of refugee, somebody who's homeless, who doesn't even have a nation. The refugee uncertain at the door, you make it home. Deftly you steady the drunk, clamoring on his indolent floor. It's a very challenging social situation when someone has had too much to drink at your residence. And the idea is that this host is able to make sure that person, that guest, retains their dignity, but also their safety. Again, a tricky thing to do if you've ever been in that particular position. Then the third stanza, we get a shift again. This person is unpredictable. And the word dear, the term of affection, is used again. So this person is clumsy and unpredictable. The taxi driver's terror. Think about some of the stereotypes associated with taxi drivers, that they're very poor drivers. So can you imagine how poor of a driver this person must be if taxi drivers are afraid of this person? In fact, this is how this person drives. Shrinking from far headlights, pale as a dime. And perhaps you've seen this where somebody is afraid to make a turn, something like a left turn, even though the car is very, very far away, so far that the headlights are pale as a dime, but still they are overly and unnecessarily cautious. Shrinking from far headlights, pale as a dime, yet leaping before red apoplectic streetcars. Again, the person who decides to make that turn or to cross the train tracks or the streetcar tracks when there's barely enough time or room to do that, and they're barely avoid an accident. A misfit in any space and never on time. And then the next stanza continues how this person is never on time. This person is a wrench, according to the author, in clocks and the solar system. So this is a person that basically is not just late, but this is somebody who influences the very fabric of time itself in a negative way. But then the stanza continues and says, only with words and people in love, you move at ease. So this is this person's strength and their grace. Words, people, and love. In traffic of wit, expertly maneuver. I very much like that line because we were just talking about traffic earlier and taxi drivers and how poor of a driver this person is. But think about the parallels between driving a car and driving a conversation. And that this person is witty. A conversation can be stop and go, much like driving can be stop and go. There is a possibility of an accident, that you could be derailed and go off in the wrong direction, both when you're driving, you can get lost, as well as in a conversation. But in a traffic of wit, expertly maneuver and keep us. So this person is talking about not just themselves, but probably the family as well. Keep us, and perhaps some close friends, all devotion at your knees. That this person is so loved, despite their physical clumsiness, that they worship this person, which is why they are at this person's knees, because they're kneeling. Forgetting your coffee spreading on our flannel. That coffee would be spreading on their flannel because this person spilled their drink on other people's clothes. Your lipstick grinning on our coat. And considering the time period in which this was written, 1947, lipstick is probably in reference to the gender of the person, while certainly any gender can wear lipstick. Again, thinking about 1947, this poem is probably written to a woman, leaving behind makeup on other people's clothing, because again, they're not very cautious, at least from a physical standpoint. So gaily in love's unbreakable heaven, that the one thing that can't be broken is love. And objects can be broken, but love cannot be broken. Our souls on glory of spilt bourbon float. That when this person spills something like bourbon, people around this person rejoice, because that means this person is nearby. They aren't upset that something has been broken or something has been spilled. And then the very last stanza, be with me, darling, early and late. Again, that term of affection, darling. This person is saying, please be with me, regardless of whether you're early or late. Smash glasses and break glasses. I will study rhyme music for your sake. In other words, that if something were to break like a glass, that would be musical, not something that's discordant. For should your hands drop wide and empty? And someone's hands would drop wide and empty if they were dead. All the toys of the world would break. And I'm very fond of that line. Imagine all the toys of the world breaking. Toys associated with positives and breaking with negatives. There wouldn't be any joy anymore if all the toys of the world had broken. So this gives you an idea of the distinction between formulaic poetry, the wonderful magic of love, as opposed to the kind of poetry that we'll be reading that has depth and complexity to it and requires some thought and requires some analysis. Now, this isn't a poetry class, but if it were a poetry class, we would talk more about the structure of poems. And in fact, you can go through a poem and scan a poem. And basically, when you would be scanning a poem, what you would be doing is going through that poem for a beat or a rhythm. It would be very similar in some respects to the way that you could diagram a sentence and go through a sentence and identify all the parts of speech, nouns and verbs and pronouns and so forth. And that could be a useful exercise, but I don't know if it's particularly important in terms of interpretation, unless you could say something about the structure. So I don't know if it's very important that the pronoun I would be used multiple times in a sentence in a short story, if you diagram that sentence, unless you wanted to make an argument that the I is very self-centered and the character is self-centered and always referencing themselves, I. And that way you could talk about how structure might be important to interpretation. And it's the same with scanning. Certainly you want to try to identify a particular beat or rhythm, but if you do find a beat or rhythm, then you need to not just identify it, but talk about how or why it might be important. And there's an example of this on page 760 with a poem entitled Waiting for the Storm. And what we see in this particular poem is that it has been scanned. In other words, somebody has gone through and made notations to indicate things like rhyme or indicate things like meter, so that you can see that there is a beat to the particular poem. And the poem originally didn't have all of those marks, the slashes and the accent marks. Those are what were added afterwards when somebody scanned it. So first I'll read the poem the way it would sound if it were scanned. Breeze sent a wrinkling darkness across the bay. I knelt beneath an upturned boat, and moment by moment felt the sand at my feet grow colder, the damp air chill and spread. Then the first rain drop sounded on the hull above my head. Now, obviously, that's not the way you're supposed to read the poem. The way you should read the poem is, breeze sent a wrinkling darkness across the bay. I knelt beneath an upturned boat, and moment by moment felt the sand at my feet grow colder, the damp air chill and spread. Then the first raindrop sounded on the hull above my head. But if we were to go through and scan this poem, we could identify that there is indeed a beat, and it speeds up over the course of the poem. And again, the response is, so what? You would need to try to identify how and why that's significant. But think about the content of this poem and the title, Waiting for the Storm. That this is somebody who is waiting for a storm. That a breeze is sending a wrinkling darkness across the bay, so they're by the water. And they kneel beneath an upturned boat. In other words, they're seeking shelter. And moment by moment felt the sand at my feet grow colder. So we see a transition or a change in the weather, something negative, as if a storm is coming. The damp air chill and spread. The air becomes colder and damper. Then the first raindrops sounded on the hull above my head. Remember, they're underneath the boat. In other words, it's begun to rain. But think about how the beat of the poem can help mimic the sound of rain on the hull of the boat. Beginning slowly first, breeze sent a wrinkling darkness. Across the bay I knelt, beneath an upturned boat, and moment by moment felt the sand at my feet grow colder, the damp air chill and spread. Then the first rain drop sounded on the hull above my head. So in other words, the beat reinforces what's happening within the poem. So you could scan a poem, but you can also read a poem for rhyme. And this is something that we talked about at the beginning of the semester when we were talking about A Sorrowful Woman, as she was contemplating writing a sonnet, which is going to be the first poem that we will be discussing in our poetry section next class, sonnets. But when she was thinking about writing a sonnet, she thought about ABBA. And what that was in reference to was the rhyme scheme or the rhyme pattern. So you can read a poem and try to identify if there is a pattern with the ending words of each line, if they have similar sounds. And you use letters of the alphabet to indicate each new sound. So A would be the first sound, and anything that rhymes with that sound would be identified as an A. B would be a new sound, and anything that identifies or anything that rhymes with that B sound would be a B, and so forth and so on. And once you've identified the sounds through the letters of the alphabet in your poem, you can see if there's any kind of pattern. And again, very similar, the question is not whether or not a pattern exists, but how or why that pattern might be important in terms of our understanding the poem. So it's not just enough to say that there is a pattern. You need to, if rhyme, you need to talk about how and why that rhyme would be significant. So they give you an example of this on page 777 with a very short poem that's entitled Upon Julia's Clothes. And originally when this poem was written, it didn't have the italicized letters at the ending of the lines, the A's and the B's. Those were added in afterwards when somebody went through and basically identified the rhyme scheme or rhyme pattern in this poem. So first I'm going to read the poem, which is by Robert Herrick, Upon Julia's Clothes, 1648. When as in silks my Julia goes, then methinks how sweetly flows that liquefaction of her clothes. Then when I cast mine eyes and see that brave vibration each way free, oh, how that glittering taketh me. So you can see that this poem is in two stanzas. The first stanza being, when as in silks my Julia goes, then methinks how sweetly flows that liquefaction of her clothes. That's the first stanza. And then we have a break. And the second stanza is, next when I cast mine eyes and see that brave vibration each way free, oh, how that glittering taketh me. So if we were to go through this particular poem and identify the rhyme scheme or pattern, we would look at the last word of each line. So the last word in the first line is goes. So that would be identified with the letter A. That would be our first rhyme. And then we would go to the second line and look at the last word in the second line. And that word is flows. And flows does rhyme with goes. So that's a repetition of that rhyme. So in other words, it's AA. And if we were to look at the third line, we would see that that line ends with the word close, which also rhymes with flows and goes. In other words, it's another repetition of A. So we have three A's. In other words, this is the beginning of our rhyme pattern or scheme. Then when we move to the second stanza, we see that the fourth line ends with the word C. C does not rhyme with goes, flows, or close, so we need to move to the next letter of the alphabet. That happens to be B. So this is a new rhyme that we've established. And then we go to the following line, and we see that that line ends with the word free. Free does rhyme with the word C, so that's a repetition of that B rhyme. And then finally, the last line of the poem, it ends with the word me, and me also rhymes with free and C. So that is also a repetition of B. So basically, if you're looking at this poem, which is 6 lines long, our rhyme scheme or pattern is AAA, BBB. And again, the question isn't what is the rhyme scheme or pattern, but how or why that might be important. So if you think about the content of this particular poem, the first stanza, when in silks my Julia goes, then methinks how sweetly flows that liquefaction of her clothes. This is somebody who's admiring somebody named Julia and her clothing, her silk clothing. So that's identified by one rhyme, the rhyme A. The next stanza reads, next when I cast mine eyes and see that brave vibration each way free, oh, how that glittering taketh me. So this next stage, the first stage was Julia in clothing. The next stage is Julia nude, out, no longer wearing those silk clothes. And that this person is saying that that's even more impressive than Julia in silk. In other words, there's been a transition from a state of clothed to unclothed. So it makes perfect sense that we would have a new rhyme because there's a new transition. Now, this isn't necessarily the only way to read this particular poem, but certainly you can see how that particular reading would work in terms of understanding the rhyme scheme or the rhyme pattern. So on page 627, we are given some suggestions about writing about poetry, and that's how I'm going to end today. This might be a page that perhaps you might want to dog ear, and it talks a little bit about, well, actually on page 628, who is the speaker? Is it possible to determine the speaker's age or sex or sensibility or level of awareness or values? Is the speaker addressing anybody in particular, or is it more to a general audience? Number 3, how did you respond to the speaker? Favorably, negatively? Number 4, is there a specific setting of time and place that's identified in the poem? And if so, it's probably important. Number 5, does reading the poem out loud help you? And I suggest it would. Number 6, does a paraphrase reveal the basic purpose of the poem? And I suggest it would, putting in your own words. 7, what does the title emphasize? 8, is the theme directly or indirectly stated? And as we know from literature, it's more likely that it will be indirect than direct. 9, do any allusions or any connections between ideas enrich the poem's meaning? 10, how does the diction reveal meaning, the use of words? Are there any words that are repeated, or are there any puns or any kind of verbal wit? Keep in mind, catch, it's all about wit, the poem that I had talked about earlier. Are there any figures of speech used? Are there any objects, persons, places, events, or actions that have symbolic or allegorical meanings? 13, is irony used, and if so, how? 14, what is the tone of the poem, and is it consistent? 15 and 16, are there sounds that are repeated, and if so, why? 37, is there a particular meter or beat to the poem, and if so, why? 18, the poem's form, structure, does it follow an established pattern, or is it breaking expectations and rules? 19, is the language of the poem intense and concentrated? And I suspect the answer will be yes, and that means it requires more than 1 or 2 readings. 20, did you enjoy the poem? You don't necessarily have to enjoy all the poems. 21, is there a particular critical approach that seems appropriate for studying this poem, such as biographical information about the author, or historical information about the poem, or perhaps your own experiences, values, beliefs, and assumptions inform your interpretation? Question 25, what kinds of evidence from the poem are you focusing on to support your interpretation? And does your interpretation leave out any important elements that might undercut or qualify your interpretation? And lastly, given there are a variety of ways to interpret the poem, which one seems most useful to you and why? So that's where I'm going to stop today. In the next class, we can begin with the actual poetry unit. I see this mostly as introduction. And for our attendance question, which will be due Saturday on the 23rd at 10 a.m., is what, after all of this, is your personal definition of poetry and why? So I've already established there is no neat, tidy definition for poetry, but after everything that you've heard about poetry and any past experiences you might have had about poetry, what would you say your definition of poetry is and why? So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and next class we will continue, starting with Shakespeare's sonnet, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? Take care. Bye-bye.